Okay, we are to chapter 9 of Teshuva, the letter of Teshuva from the Alter Rebbe, written in the early 1800s. We're going to make this relevant and as obviously as meaningful and practical as possible. Chapter 9 is a little bit of a deeper chapter as we discuss the higher levels of Teshuva called Teshuva Ila'a. So we want to make it very practical and we're also going to spin it at the end with a little bit of a talk of the Rebbe on this chapter. So we're gonna give a little bit of a summary and overview as well. I don't think we're gonna get too much inside today, and I still have to decide how much of chapter 9 and 10 we're going to learn inside. But let's start with just an overview of the chapter and a review of the previous ones. The question at the heart of the discussion over the past few weeks has been: is it possible to have a relationship with God when there's dirt in the way? And you could also use this in the same way with a relationship with another person. If there's an elephant in the room, can the relationship get deeper? Is there something in between? If there's something, an obstacle, could the relationship still work? Could the relationship still get deeper and grow if there's an elephant in the room, if there's something there? And from our previous discussion, we've made the argument, according to Tanya, that it can't. You first have to clean out the dirt. You first have to remove the obstacle. And only then are you able to deepen or grow in the relationship. The metaphor brought from different places of Chassidus. And again, the Tanya is the original book on Chabad Chassidus. And then all the Rebbes elaborates on the Tanya. So many metaphors have been given from different Rebbes after the Tanya was written. And one of the metaphors is if you want to plant in a garden, if you want to plant in a field, you first have to remove any rocks, and then it could grow. But if you try to plant a seed that's covered by rocks, there's not going to be any room for the growth of that plant, of that tree. So you first have to remove the obstacles. You first have to remove the rocks. Or if you're trying to build a home on a lot, you first have to remove anything in the way on the lot, and then you can build a home. Um, Not brought in Chassidus, but even nowadays, if you want to take out a loan to buy a home, they're going to look at your credit. And if you have bad credit, you're not going to be able to buy a home. You're not going to be able to take a loan. Good morning, Steve. You first need to um, uh, fix your credit if it's a bad credit. And then you could get a loan and buy a home. So that's the process that we see in everything in life. And the Alter Rebbe says when it comes to our relationship with God, in order for the relationship to deepen and to be in a close, authentic, honest relationship with God, you first have to remove any obstacle or any elephant in the room, any dirt and schmutz. The example we've given, in previous weeks was the kiska that is still filled with the with the garbage. You can't. It's not going to taste good. You could put all the nice spices, but it's not going to be good. A person, if they smell, you could try to cover it up with nice cologne and deodorant, but ultimately, if the person smells, it's going to get through even that. You first have to take a shower. You first have to take care, clean it out, and then you could add some good spices, some good cologne. Point is, you can't deepen any relationship without first fixing or repairing the past or fixing the trauma that we've had in the past. Over here, the word trauma I'm using in terms of our relationship with God is in a place of sin. If you did something that fractures the relationship, you need to do teshuva first, which repairs that, and then it removes the rocks, removes any obstacles, cleans the credit, so to speak, and then you could grow and deepen. So our neshama came to this world as a pristine, godly, golden neshama soul, but it's living in a material, crass world. It gets influenced, it gets desensitized, and the soul gets schmutzig. The soul gets dirty. So the soul becomes compromised, and it's almost like a soul abuse, an abuse of the soul that is happening in this world. So that needs to be corrected. So in chapter 7, when we started the lower level of Teshuva over here, we learned the lower step of the Teshuva process, and that is having mercy or pity for our soul, for what it's been through, for what it has to feel in going through the sin, having coming from such a golden, pristine, godly, pure place to now a place of sin. It's exile of the soul, it's abuse of the soul. So you have to arouse compassion for your soul. And when you do that, God will reflect that compassion that you have for your soul with a compassion for you and a compassion for your soul. And then you can reach a higher level, which is going to be the higher teshuva, which we're discussing last week and this week. It's almost like you can't reach a higher floor of a building, or you can't get to the roof of a building without going through the lower floors. So you can't do the higher teshuva without the lower teshuva first. You can't just bypass and say, you know what, the lower teshuva is boring, the lower teshuva is daunting. I'm just going to go to the higher teshuva. You need to do both. One of the great Hasidic teachers and thinkers, his name was Rabbi Yoel Khan. He passed away a couple of years ago. He was one of the main teachers and one of the main students of the Rebbe and one of the main teachers of Hasidus of our generation. And he says you can have self-sacrifice to jump off a building. There's a story of Hannah and her seven sons in the story of Hanukkah. Hannah saw and she taught her children the ways of Torah, and they were ready to have self-sacrifice for the sake of the Torah and to remain honest and true to the ways of Torah. And in that same drive of Torah, he was ready to jump off a roof rather than to submit to idolatry and adultery and and other bad sins. She jumped off a roof. So Rabbi says a person could jump off a roof driven by self-sacrifice, but a person can't jump onto a roof driven by self-sacrifice, which means no matter how high you want to jump with your motivation of self-sacrifice, you're not going to get to the top of a building by a jump. You need to go through the lower parts of the building, which means you can't just jump to the higher teshuva. It needs to happen first with the lower teshuva, which means it takes work, it takes effort. So chapter 7 began that lower part of teshuva, the effort of climbing up that ladder, which is arousing mercy for our soul. And then Hashem will respond with mercy, which comes from the 13 attributes of mercy. It's known in Hebrew as the Yud Gimel Midos Harachamim, and we elaborated on it last week about where it comes from the story of the golden calf. God taught these to Moshe, and Moshe used these 13 attributes of mercy by the story of the spies, when God wanted to be done with the Jewish people, called us a stiff-necked people. Um, Moshe aroused the 13 attributes of mercy of God, and that led to our forgiveness. And we sing that a lot on Yom Kippur. Once we do that, then we could get to a higher level of teshuva. And like last week, what we learned is about allowing our soul to be interlocked with God, to be in sync and to be realigned again, the way we were at the beginning, which means wiping away that sin, which happens through the lower teshuva. So now it could be in a place where it's like the sin didn't even happen. It's totally a clean slate. That's happening through the higher teshuva. Now, the argument we're going to be making here is the higher teshuva can only happen from a place of love and a place of closeness. So, in general, a relationship with God comes from, in Hebrew, known as ahava or yira. It could come from a place of ahava, which means love, or a place of yira, which means fear. Now, when we say the word fear, it can have different explanations. And if you go back to the first book of the Tanya in chapters 41 and on, it talks about the fear of God. Fear could mean very basic. You're scared of what's going to happen to you for doing this. A person who is, you know, not driving the speed limit, hoping not to get a ticket. He's driven from a place of fear not to get a ticket, not to be charged a couple $100s. So he's driving the speed limit, but out of a place of fear. A person could be in a relationship, but they're fearful if they act out, they're fearful of the consequences. Or obviously a higher place of fear would be they're fearful of losing the relationship. And the same as with God. A person could be motivated out of fear not to do a sin or to do the right thing, to do a mitzvah, positive or negative, motivated by a place of fear that they don't want to lose the relationship. They don't want to miss the opportunity that they have with God. It's coming from a place of distance. Either distance that they're scared of the distance that comes, so they're motivated from this distance, or they distance or fear could also be from a higher place that they're in awe of God. They feel so far, and therefore they do things because of that trepidation they feel of God. But chapter 9 over here is going to make the argument that when it comes to the higher level of Teshuva, it can be performed from a place of fear. It needs to be done from a place of love. It needs to be done from a place of closeness. And to explain or elaborate on this point, the Alter Rebbe is going to quote a verse of the Torah in chapter 9. And the verse of the Torah is coming from one of the very famous mitzvahs that you're perhaps familiar with, which is sending away the mother bird. It's a mitzvah that the Torah promises long life. And in Hebrew, the verse of the Torah says, Ha'im rovetzet al ha'efrochim, which means the mother bird, the mother is resting on her chicks. And the mitzvah is in the land of Israel that if you see a mother resting on the eggs or the chicks, you can't take the eggs or the chicks while the mother bird is still there. You first have to send away the mother bird, and only then can you take the eggs or the chicks. That's the mitzvah of, in Hebrew, is known as Tiluach Hakan. But the verse of the Torah says, Em rovetzet al efrochim. Em is the mother, Ima, and Efroach is the chick, the babies of the mother bird. That the mitzvah is you have to send it away. So over here, the aim Revetzat al Efrochim, the Alter Rebbe explains it based on Kabbalah. What does it mean, the mother? What does it mean, the chicks? Kabbalah explains that this verse is relating to the higher level of Teshuva. I want to explain to you how. The aim, the mother, and the Efrochim and the chicks are a reference for our intellectual powers and our emotional powers. Just like the mother gives birth to her children, the intellect gives birth to the feeling. So it starts in the mind, which is like the mother, the parent, and then it goes to the heart, which is the place of the feelings, which is developed from the mind. So depending what we think about, that's the feeling that we will have towards something, away from something, etc. So higher teshuva is this concept of the mother on the child, which means for our intellectual powers and our emotional powers to be fully aligned with God's intellectual powers and God's emotional powers. It needs to be fully in sync, which means as follows. Many times we could be studying Torah, or we could be doing a mitzvah, but we do it not fully aligned with God. We do it really for our own things. Morally, we do acts of kindness because it's the right thing to do. It makes sense to do it. But we all know that eventually our morals could tell us to do things that are not in line with God or not the correct thing, but our morals are telling us it's the right thing. Even hurting someone, murdering someone could come from a place that from my morals, it's telling me it's the right thing to do because they disagree with who I am. And we see that now more than I think in any other time of history, that because my morals are challenged, I'm going to hurt someone else. So as long as we're doing it with our own morals, it's not the correct thing. aim or vetzet al frochim is to make sure that our intellectual powers, our emotional powers, are fully in line with the intellectual and emotional way of God. Um, that we're doing it motivated from a place of wanting to connect with God. Kind of a corny joke, but they say it, or I don't know if it's inappropriate, but they say the joke of the Jewish couple that every week they were visited on Friday by the local schnorrer. The schnorrer was a person who always came to collect money, never wanted to get a job, so the man of the home felt fed up, and he was like, I work so hard, and this person just comes to my home and expects a freebie. So I'm going to teach him a lesson. He went to the store and he bought a moldy piece of fish. And he went to the store every week for Shabbos and to buy fish. But this week he came back with a moldy piece of fish. And his wife said, What are we going to do with this moldy fish? He says, Don't worry, I have it all figured out. The schnorrer came on Friday, and the man graciously opened the door and says, I have the perfect thing for you. And he gave him this moldy piece of fish. And the schnorrer, not realizing, was so thankful, went home, ate the fish, and got sick. So on Sunday, the husband tells the wife, honey, I'm going to do a mitzvah of Bikkur Cholim. I'm going to visit the sick. And sadly, shortly after the visit, the schnorrer didn't make it. That moldy fish killed him. So on Monday, the husband tells the wife, honey, I'm going to do the mitzvah of tending to the dead, of escorting Levi, of burying the dead. And on Tuesday, he says, honey, I'm going to do the mitzvah of comforting the mourners. And he says, look what this moldy fish was able to do. It gave us the mitzvah of hospitality. It gave us the mitzvah of burying the dead. It gave us the mitzvah of visiting the sick. It gave us the mitzvah of comforting the mourners. 4 mitzvahs I was able to do with one moldy piece of fish. So, of course, if our morals are not aligned, not in the right place, a person could be doing mitzvahs and stuff, but it's coming from the wrong place. It's not the right thing. So we have to do it because it's in line with God. It's doing it because Hashem wants us to do it. We elevate when we do that with being in line and being connecting to God, we elevate our human self to Hashem, and that restores the relationship. So chapter 9 is going to be elaborating on the idea that higher teshuva is to be fully in line with God, to be fully in sync with God. Last week we explained the difference of a tzaddik and a Baal Teshuva. A tzaddik is also in line with God, but a Baal Teshuva does it with this strong level of drive and motivation of wanting that relationship so strongly. Hela Yatir was the quote from the Zohar. There's an intensity in the relationship of a Baal Teshuva wanting that connection with God because they know they're motivated by what they have done in the past, and now they're running to God with this strong sense of closeness and to be aligned in line with God. So the key over here, chapter 9 says, is for the higher teshuva to work, it needs to be done and it needs to be driven from a place of love, a place of closeness to God. In the olden days, a relationship with God built on fear worked quite well. Before Hasidus came along, that was a pretty natural thing. You do the right thing to be in a relationship with God, not to end up in hell, not to be punished. It was a pretty common idea that if you don't do the right thing, you're going to be either punished in this world or punished in the next world. But Tanya says that if you want to reach this higher level of teshuva, it can't work motivated by sin. The lower teshuva find that fear, motivated by fear. The lower teshuva could work if you're motivated by fear, but you're not going to ever be able to attain a higher level of teshuva from a place of fear, from a place of distance of God. It needs to be from a place of interlocking yourself with God and a feeling of closeness with God, a feeling of love. In halacha, there's the explanation about how teshuva works. And earlier in the chapters, we actually opened the Rambam to elaborate a little bit on it. But now there's another halacha from the Rambam and from Jewish law, from Talmud, where it says like this: when is teshuva complete? When here, I'm just going to quote the halacha and then I'll explain it a little bit. Teshuva is complete when it's in the same circumstance. To quote the halacha, it says, "Va'oto makom, va'oto isha." It has to be the same circumstance, which means you're in a place just like this where in the past you've committed a sin, and now you're in the same position and you won't commit the sin. That's when you know teshuva is complete. So the example that the halacha gives is from a person who sins in an illicit relationship, in an inappropriate relationship, and says that if you're in the same place, which means you're in the same room alone with the same woman, with the same person, so the circumstances are the same, and that's when you say, no, I can't do this. That's when you know teshuva is real. Um, there's unfortunately every now and then there's a story of a kosher butcher or a meat store that sells kosher that is found cheating, which means they um, they they're found to be packing non-kosher meats and putting them in a kosher package and selling them for the kosher price, which is a little more expensive perhaps, but they're making a bigger profit because they're actually they're really selling non-kosher meat, which is cheaper. And unfortunately, it happened in LA on Pico maybe a little more than a decade ago. It was a big deal. It happened in Muncie maybe a handful of years ago. And it's obviously a travesty and it's very sad. Imagine the amount of people that were relying on this, you know, store for kosher, and then it comes out that he was cheating the whole community. And that person is probably, for the most part, is religious. And it makes it even harder. And there's a mashgiach, but they would learn how to sneak it in when the mashgiach, the supervisor, wasn't looking. It's unfortunate stories, and unfortunately, it happens. So the Rambam tells us, how do we know that a person who does such a sin is forgiven when they're in the same position and they're given the same opportunity and they refuse to do it? They refuse to sin or cheat. So the Alter Rebbe over here wants to learn something incredible about this halacha. It's not just that the circumstance has to be the same of the weather and the person and the ambiance. The Alter Rebbe learns that teshuva, for it to be real, the higher level of teshuva is it needs to be in the same circumstance, which means with the same intensity and with the same drive as when you committed the sin. What it means in a deeper level, what does it mean that it has to be in the same circumstance as the sin in order for the tshuva to work? The Alter Rebbe learns kabbalistically that it means it has to be with the same intensity of how you committed the sin. You committed the sin with such intensity of love. Most people commit a sin out of love, out of desire. So the teshuva needs to be with that same level of desire and love as when you committed the sin. That's higher teshuva, when you're not just remorseful, you're not just committing not to do it, you're not just cleaning the stones or cleaning the schmutz. You want to clean the slate totally, which means that you're reenacting the sin, but in a place of being aligned with God, which means you're in the same intensity that you had when you were committing the sin, but now your intensity is devoted to God, which means your mother and your child, which means the intellectual powers, are totally consumed with Torah, with God's wisdom. So your mind, which was consumed with sin, is now in the same place, but fully consumed with Torah, with God's wisdom. When your heart and your feelings, which were totally consumed with desire and inappropriate lust, is now fully consumed with a love for God to do what God wants. And not just because I feel that it's the right thing, but because I'm in line, I'm in tune, I'm in sync with God. And therefore, you're doing the right thing from a place of love and closeness and that intensity of that love. That's the higher teshuva, when you're in sync with God and you're doing it from a place of love. So it's similar to you watch on YouTube every now and then, or in the news, of a person who, God forbid, was attacked by a shark in the ocean while surfing. And over again, the news is really when that person, after having a thousand stitches and losing a limb, they go back in the water to heal from that trauma. You have to revisit that same that same place. Or if there's a child that, and definitely if you lived in Brooklyn, you could relate to this idea. I don't think anyone here did, but you could relate to the idea that if you're in a broken elevator as a child, it's very traumatic. You don't know if you're ever going to make it out. So, and a lot of times they never want to go back in an elevator because of that fear. So to break that fear, you would have to go back in an elevator, and the sooner you do it, the I wouldn't say the easier, but the quicker the healing can happen. So what I'm saying is repair doesn't happen without facing the same situation, and we know that over and over again, especially now that we have to revisit the place of trauma in order to be able to heal from it. You can't just cover it up and expect it to go away. Eventually, it's going to catch up with you. So sin is coming from a place of closeness and a place of desire and a place of love. And therefore, teshuva needs to be with that same, you have to revisit that same intensity but and love, but now with a feeling of love for God. So it needs to be similar, same circumstance, but now in a healing place, in a place of closeness to God, in a place of being in sync with God. And that's the higher level of teshuva. The ending of the ending of chapter 9, it elaborates on that in the Zohar, which is one of the great Kabbalistic books that a lot of the Tanya is based on, talks a lot about the sin of for a man of emitting seed, of spilling his seed. And it's the original place is from the Torah. It says the Yehuda, one of the 12 sons of Yaakov of the 12 tribes, had three sons. Actually started with having two sons, Er and Onan, and he married Er to a woman named to a woman named Tamar, and Er died, and then married her to Onan, and Onan died, and it says in Rashi, commenting from the Talmud, which takes the verse of the Torah that says he saw that the children, goes through the verse and says that they were spilling their seed. They didn't want Tamar to get pregnant. So in the Zohar, it elaborates about this sin, and the Alter Rebbe explains why. Because the sin of spilling seed, it's coming from the mind, which means it's the seed of a man is rooted in the mind from his wisdom, and from the wisdom is aroused. It's it's scientifically proven that it's not the case. But in earlier generations, it used to be thought that the seed comes from the mind and goes through the spine into the male organ and to have seed. It's obviously proven scientifically that's not the case, but spiritually, um, that's how it would work. So it comes from the mind. So therefore, to repair the sin of spilling seed, the Zohar says it happens through intensity of studying of Torah, because the sin comes from the mind, and therefore the repair needs to come from that same place. It needs to come from the mind, which is to devote yourself with an intensity of studying of Torah that would repair it. There's a sefer, a Torah book called Tana Dvei Eliyahu, which is teachings from the Academy of Elijah. Elijah was Elijah the prophet, and it says that he has teachings and he had students. So they wrote a book based on the teachings of Elijah, which is fascinating. It's called Tana Devei Eliyahu, the teachings of the Academy of Elijah. And in this sefer, Tana Devei Eliyahu, it says that if a person sinned, ma what should he do to live? What should he do and live? Meaning he committed a sin. What should he do? And it answers if he would study one page of Torah a day, he should study two. If he studied two, he should study four. He should double his Torah study more than he would usually do. And what's this all about? What do you mean if you sinned? If you sinned, you do Teshuva. So it's explained in the Tanya over here in chapter 9 that this question, what should you do and live? It's a weird expression. What should you do and live? It's talking about a sin that regular tshuva doesn't help. Lower teshuva won't help. And it's talking about this sin of emitting seed, spilling seed. That what should you do? You have to commit yourself to Torah study because that's where the sin comes from the mind. And therefore you have to double your efforts in your Torah study to interlock your mind, with God's wisdom, in order to for teshuva to work. So if that's the case, something incredible comes out from here, is that to this type of sin, lower teshuva doesn't help. You need to come on to a higher level of teshuva. It talks about in the ending of the chapter, it talks about there was a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, just after the Jewish people um, were in Israel. So after Joshua dies, um, there was, and then we had a couple great prophetess named Devorah and judges named Shimshon or Samson. But when before the sanctuary made it to Jerusalem with King David and eventually building the temples with Solomon with Shlomo, the Kohen Gadol at the time was a man by the name of Eli, not Eli, but Eli. His name was Eli, and he had two sons. If I'm not mistaken, their names were Chafni and Pinchas. Not the Pinchas that we know from the Torah, the Zealot. This is another Pinchas that lived a couple generations later. And Eli is famous because it was during Eli's leadership as high priest that he nurtured the young baby named Samuel, Shmuel. But he's the one that had conversation with Shmuel's mother named Hannah, where she came to the sanctuary to pray, and Eli misunderstood or was confused and thought that she was drunk because she was praying quietly, which nowadays we all pray quietly. That's the Amida, the highest level of our prayer is the quiet prayer. But in those days, it was unheard of. Before Amida came a thing, she was just offering a prayer, but it was a quiet prayer. And Eli thought she was drunk. And Eli says, "What are you doing here, you drunk woman?" And she says, "No, I'm pouring out my soul, praying for a child." And when he understood that she was sincere, he blessed her with a child. And she had a child named Shmuel. She dedicated his life to God. She brought him to Eli when he was a young child, and he became the great Samuel, the great prophet. But Eli himself had two children. Their names were Chafni and Pinchas. And they unfortunately were corrupt. They were doing terrible things. They were feeding the Jews on their sacrifices, telling them you need this sacrifice, and they would really be keeping it for themselves and selling it on the black market. They were involved in illicit relations. They were doing bad things. And I have to learn it better, but I'm pretty sure that Eli knew it, but didn't rebuke them. So they got punished. And in fact, the whole family of Eli were cursed. And through Shmuel, the prophet, as a young child, God gave a prophecy through him and cursed Eli's family. And that's exactly what happened. Both of Eli's children died, and then he died, and the whole family and their lineage was destroyed. The verse over there, and Tanya quotes it over here. The verse by in the story of in the book of Samuel, the story of Eli, in the opening chapters, it says that no amount of sacrifices will be able to forgive their sin. The illicit relations that they had, you can't buy out your sins through sacrifices. You can't repair and do teshuva through a sacrifice. That's the verse. So the Talmud learns based on this verse that says no sacrifice will atone for the sin. And the Talmud learns a sacrifice won't atone for the sin, but Torah study will atone for the sin. So we see that there's certain sins that Torah study or a higher level of teshuva with that intensity is the only thing that could work to do teshuva. The lower teshuva won't work, only a more intense level of teshuva that is with the same intensity and from the same situation of where the sin came from, that's where the teshuva has to come from as well. So to summarize what we've said, there's a lower teshuva, there's a higher teshuva. It goes in a process. You can't get to the top of the building without going through the bottom floors of the building, which means first you have to do the lower teshuva, and then you could attain a higher level of teshuva. And there are certain situations where the effect of the sin could only be repaired through a level of teshuva that after doing the lower teshuva, your sin is still not healed. You need to come onto the higher level of teshuva because it needs to match the same intensity of the sin, and that's only with a higher level of teshuva. But to add one curveball, so to speak, and to finish the thought with an idea that the Rebbe shared in 1954. So obviously the Tanya and this book of the Tanya was written in I think 1805 or the early 1800s, 1806. And that's the method. You start with the lower teshuva, you go to higher teshuva, you first clean out the rocks from the field, and then you could plant. You first clean out the dirt of the kishka, and then you could fill it up with all the good spices. You first clean out a house, and then you bring in the good furniture and the beautiful mahogany desks and stuff. But the Rebbe learned something, and in 1954, the Rebbe taught something new. And the Rebbe says that the generation that we are in now, we can't wait for the lower teshuva to happen. Even though the process, the Alter Rebbe says over here, is lower teshuva, climb the ladder, and then higher teshuva. Now, the Rebbe says in 1954 that today we were given the ability to jump, which is an incredible idea, and I want to elaborate. The fourth Chabad Rebbe, his name was Shmuel. He was known as the Rebbe Maharash. And he once said that, stay in my name, that the whole world says that if you can't go, if you're stuck, if you're confronted by a wall and you can't go on the side of the wall and you can't go under the wall, then you should go over the wall. But I, meaning talking about the Rebbe Maras, say he passed away in 18 here the Rebbe Maras passed away. I don't remember. But I say that lechatchila from the get-go, you should go right over. You shouldn't try to go to the side, you should just jump over. Now, our Rebbe took that to much, the Rebbe would share that often. Even though it was the Rebbe Marash's idea, it became one of the Rebbe's slogans. He would always attribute it to the Rebbe Marash, but the Rebbe lived with this idea that you just go right over. Don't make all the calculations, just do. And these are not the Rebbe's words, but in other places, the Rebbe would say the person could become, you don't need money anymore to be able to buy a house. It used to be you have to save and save and save, and then you have enough to buy a house. Nowadays, we all see that people don't have money and they still manage to buy a home. You take loans and you figure it out. The same, those are not the Rebbe's exact words, but the Rebbe actually gave blessings to people that in the 1960s, there was a big a shift in the Crown Heights and the Brooklyn community where there was a lot more crime than in previous years. In the 50s, in the 40s, 50s, Crown Heights was a very, very upscale community. And crime started taking over the community in the 60s, and a lot of other Jewish communities that lived in Crown Heights left. They moved to Williamsburg, they moved to Borough Park. People were scared of living in Crown Heights. the Rebbe didn't want any of his Chabad Hasidim to leave. He didn't want any Hasidim to leave. But they didn't listen to the Rebbe, but Chabad Hasidim, Lubavitchers obviously listened to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe wanted us to buy homes, to establish ourselves here. And there were people that came to the Rebbe and says, I want to fulfill the Rebbe's advice, but I don't have money. I didn't save. And the Rebbe says, nowadays, you don't need money to buy a home. And, I could share with, if you want, a beautiful video of someone by the last name of Popek. And for those that came to the Advice for Life series, JLI series that we gave back in May and June, he shares the story, and he ends by saying that we started, putting together a loan, and we were able to buy a small home. And he concludes by saying, and I make a decent living. And he's a very, very wealthy person, but he started with buying a home in the 60s when he didn't even have any money. The point I'm trying to make is the Rebbe would argue that nowadays you don't, which means nowadays we were given the ability to reach the stars without too much preparation. We could reach the moon. In the 60s, it took a lot of preparation. Nowadays, anyone could buy a ticket and you could go on, I think it's SpaceX, or these different planes, and you can make your way out of space. It's still very expensive, but eventually it's going to become a pretty normal thing to be able to fly, to be able to reach higher when you never thought you can. Um, the Rebbe's argument is our job now is to just do good. Even if you're full of smuts and you feel you have so much baggage, don't let that stop you. Don't wait for the Teshuva to be complete in order to be able to reach the stars. Nowadays, we can reach the stars without too much calculations. So if I'm understanding, with everything we're learning over here in chapter 8 and 9 about higher Teshuva, and there's a process of lower Teshuva and then higher Teshuva, the Rebbe argues, starting from 1954, that this, if you bring a Jew closer without waiting for them to give up their old habits, bring them in. So nowadays it sounds so normal, because that's what Chabad does everywhere. But in the 1950s, it was unheard of. That's where, when the young couples were going out, the Rebbe would send, and Mitzvayim, which were the Rebbe's mitzvah campaigns, to reach out to Jews and bring them closer. Um, at the time, it was so not only novel, it was so counter, not only traditional Torah, it was against Tanya, it was against Chassidus, of the method of lower Teshuvah than higher Teshuvah. And here the Rebbe saying is just pack the house with good things, even when there's still pests around, which was counterintuitive to everyone. But the Rebbe trained us that it's not that the Rebbe is going against the advice of previous generations. It was that our style is different. The world style is different. Now, in the previous generations, we weren't able to reach the stars. We had to go through a calculated method. But now, the abundance that we see in the world, we're able to do things, and we're able to jump in a way that was never possible in previous generations, and therefore that offers a new way of teshuvah. That you could reach higher teshuvah without even doing lower teshuvah, which means you could be in an intensity of love in your relationship with God without going through a calculated method of something else first, of the arousing mercy on your soul and the meditation, and that triggers God's mercy for you, the 13 attributes of mercy. All that is good. And the Rebbe is not arguing that you shouldn't do that. But the Rebbe is saying, don't wait for that to happen. Go straight for the top. Go in your intensity of your love with God, and let that carry you, and also fulfill the lower level of teshuvah, which is the mercy and the meditation, etc., that has to come as well. And I think for the generation we're in now, this method, the method that it needs to start with that love. The normal method is there's fear, there's love. You need both. You need a balance. And I'm not saying the fear is not there anymore. We still need that, but the balance is not balanced anymore. The love needs to be the driving force. It needs to be the first touch that we reach out. It needs to be the first touch when we reach in. It needs to be from a place of love. And when you have that intensity of love, of that relationship with God, that relationship with yourself, that relationship with others, it will drive you and allow you to jump to a place that you didn't even know you can, which means you could unleash an incredible potential of your soul that you didn't even know you had if you would just take the regular method. It would take you too long to get to, and we don't have that time anymore. The world is on fire. The Rebbe would say the Jewish people are on fire. On fire meaning when there's a fire in your home, you don't make too much of a calculation. On Sunday night, I met a s- a soldier. He wasn't a soldier on October 7th. He lived in the kibbutz closest to the Nova Festival. His name is Ophir, and he's visiting Marin. So I got to meet him, and I heard a story. It's just he spoke with an incredible amount of pain. Um, hard to put it into words, the level of his pain. Many of the hostages are his classmates. The Bibas family, the redhead 1-year-old kid Kfir, and the family, the father who's a hostage was his classmate for 12 years. They grew up together in the kibbutzim. So anyway, I got to speak to him on Sunday evening, and he I put on tefillin with him. He said, "This is my first time putting on tefillin in a long time." And I gave him my yarmulke to put on tefillin, and I had an extra one, obviously. And he held on to the yarmulke. He's like, "I left, and I left when I had to leave my home. I didn't take my yarmulke with me." He took his bare essentials, and he drove. He has a story. They were in the shelter, and he went to his car, and they drove straight to Eilat. But he kept my yarmulke, and obviously I gifted it to him with such joy and such love. But you know, we have to look at the Jewish people like there's a fire in the house, and you can't make too much calculation what you're ready to take with you. You have to run. You don't have time. So our Rebbe says the generation we're in now, we can't make too many calculations. The Rebbe would laugh at, uh, joke at the idea of boards of federations where they half of their work is just meeting and voting to meet again without actually doing anything. And the Rebbe was on the opposite idea where our job is to act. Um, and obviously there needs to be a method of our actions, but don't let it stop the actions from happening. Just do. And because the Jewish world is on fire. And I think that's the method the Rebbe has based on this chapter of Tanya, where the normal method of calculation of lower teshuva or higher teshuva is beautiful, but there's a few things that don't work for our generation. Earlier in the chapters of the Tanya, what didn't work is what worked in the earlier generations was fasting. And the Rebbe says our generation is not up to fasting. You should substitute the fasting with charity, but it's going to defeat the purpose of what we're doing. Of course, there's 6 fasts of the year that we still do. Yesterday was one of them, called Tisha. Kippur is the most important one, which is in October this year. But our generation is about the action. Give the charity and put your heart in it, and that's what God wants more than anything. So over here in the later chapters, you see another huge curveball where the Rebbe says you could bypass the lower teshuva and go straight to the intensity of that love. Eventually, it should also lead you to the lower teshuva, but don't let the lower teshuva stop you from reaching the higher teshuva. All right, let's take questions now. Yes, Naomi. I'm just going to put this.